Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, narrated by Charlton Heston. Part 5.
In the late 1780s, Immanuel Kant began to work out the implications of his transcendental philosophy in remarkable detail. His investigation of human understanding led him to a number of interesting conclusions. One of the simplest yet most profound of these he expressed as follows.
We are brought to the conclusion that we can never transcend the limits of possible experience.
This means that our modes of thought are valid only when applied to the sorts of objects that appear in ordinary experience. A little reflection will make it clear why this restriction applies. The basic rules of the understanding, which Kant calls categories, shape how we perceive and understand objects in our consciousness. The whole purpose of these categories, according to Kant, is to do this. But what about objects that transcend ordinary human consciousness, such as God or the soul? Objects that many people don't believe are part of the everyday natural world. Kant replies that these are not objects of ordinary experience, so the rules that apply to common experience do not apply to them. Kant thinks that this limitation on knowledge is a positive result.
The positive advantage of critical principles can be similarly developed in regard to the concept of God and of the simple nature of our soul. From what has already been said, it is evident that even the assumption of God's freedom and immortality is not permissible, unless at the same time speculative reason be deprived of its pretensions to transcendent insight.
Scientific thinking simply can't grasp ideas like God. Kant sums up his point in a famous remark.
I have had to limit reason to make room for faith.
This limitation, on the one hand, protects religious beliefs from scientific refutation, but by the same token it denies religion the support of rational inquiry and argument. Concerning the existence of God, for example, Kant notes the following.
We may indeed be allowed to postulate the existence of an all-sufficient being as the cause of all possible effects. But in presuming to say that such a being necessarily exists, we are no longer giving modest expression to an admissible hypothesis, but are confidently laying claim to certainty.
We can't say that God necessarily exists, according to Kant, because the concept of necessity is one of the categories of the understanding. As such, it can be applied only to ordinary objects in nature.
The concept of necessity is only to be found in our reason as a formal condition of thought. It does not allow of being hypostatized as a material condition of existence.
This means that necessity can't be treated as objective reality existing independently of human understanding. We can experience natural necessities because nature is partly shaped by our perception of it. But we can't experience supernatural necessities because they transcend nature and our perception. Now, if our rational understanding applies only to natural objects in the material world, does this mean that only material things are real? No. The rules of the understanding apply to what Kant sometimes calls appearances. By this he means simply all those things that appear within our consciousness. However, because of the built-in limitations on the rules of the understanding, we can't say that everything real is an appearance in this sense.
All possible speculative knowledge of reason is limited to mere objects of experience. But our further contention must also be borne in mind, namely, that though we cannot know these objects as things in themselves, we must yet be in a position at least to think them as such.
Kant explains the distinction between knowing and thinking.
To know an object, I must be able to prove its possibility, either from experience or a priori. But I can think whatever I please, provided only that I do not contradict myself. That is, provided that my concept is a possible thought.
This means we must always leave open the possibility that things other than appearances are real. Kant calls such an object a noumenon, something that is merely thought but not experienced.
We have an understanding which problematically extends further, but we have no intuition, through which objects outside the field of sensibility can be given.
Kant's observation has a deeper meaning as well. He's saying that we're able to know the world as it appears, but we can never say with certainty that we perceive the world's ultimate character. We simply have no way to determine the ultimate character of things. As Kant writes in a much-quoted passage,
The understanding is something more than a power of formulating rules. It is itself the lawgiver of nature. Save through it, nature would not exist at all.
Kant is well aware of how peculiar it sounds to say this.
However exaggerated and absurd it may sound, to say that the understanding is itself the source of the laws of nature is nonetheless correct.
When Kant says that the understanding is the lawgiver of nature, he's merely saying that the way things appear in our consciousness depends on the way we understand them. Nature, as we know it, is shaped by human understanding. Nature in its ultimate character is therefore merely an empty, if haunting, idea. In the early 19th century, German philosophers like G.W.F. Hegel criticized Kant's theory of the limits of knowledge. Hegel wrote,
"It argues an utter lack of consistency to say on the one hand that the understanding only knows appearances, and on the other to assert the absolute character of this knowledge by such statements as cognition can go no further."
Hegel objects that Kant is in no position to define the limits of knowledge as he tries to do.
No one knows or even feels that anything is a limit or defect until he is at the same time above and beyond it. To call a thing finite or limited proves by implication the very presence of the infinite and unlimited.
Hegel sought to explore these implications and to show that Kant's thought was itself incomplete in a way that his own work was not. When Kant gets into the details of how human understanding operates, nothing but a lengthy, difficult account will do. From a professional philosopher's point of view, this detail is necessary. Happily, it's not necessary to an understanding of Kant's main ideas, nor to an appreciation of his genius. On the contrary, all too often scholars get lost in the intricacies of Kant's analysis and lose sight of his deeper aims. In a rarely noted passage in one of his last essays, Kant makes his ultimate aims very clear.
If there is a science which men need, it is the science which will teach what one must be in order to be a man.
Ultimately, Kant's philosophy is concerned with practical matters. In Kant's mind, the final measure of a philosopher or of a man of reason is not his theory, but his character. It could hardly be otherwise in a philosophy that takes as its central idea the idea of freedom. Kant analyzes the human understanding by dividing it into two primary faculties, which he calls sensibility and understanding. These two faculties preserve the kernel of truth emphasized in each of the earlier modern schools of philosophy, empiricism and rationalism. By sensibility, for example, Kant has in mind what the empiricists were trying to get at.
Sensibility is the receptivity of our mind, its power of receiving representations, insofar as it is in any wise affected.
This is very reminiscent of John Locke's image of the mind as a blank tablet on which experience writes. By contrast, the faculty of the understanding is more active.
It is the mind's power of producing representations from itself, or the spontaneity of knowledge.
The understanding corresponds roughly to the source of our innate ideas, as conceived by rationalists. Kant makes it clear that neither of these faculties functions alone.
Experience consists of intuitions, which belong to the sensibility, and of judgments and concepts, which are entirely the work of the understanding.
Kant suggests the interdependence of these two elements in a famous slogan.
Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind.
Better than any of his predecessors, Kant sees that genuine knowledge is a blend, or combination of these elements. His discussion of sensibility is particularly difficult to understand. Its full interpretation has troubled scholars from the beginning. Nonetheless, it's clear that in recognizing the faculty of sensibility, Kant is acknowledging what he calls the mind's receptivity, its capacity to receive or take in the raw materials of knowledge. He must acknowledge receptivity, or else he would have to claim that the mind creates the world out of nothing at all, and this he rejects.
We should be landed in the absurd conclusion that there can be appearance without anything that appears.
In spite of this, Kant refuses to say, like the empiricists, that he knows what raw intuitions are. He believes that until these intuitions are interpreted by the understanding, they have no definite meaning. Our faculty of sensibility is usually thought to be a receptive function, but Kant says it has an active and creative power as well. He describes how he discovers this.
We shall, therefore, first isolate sensibility by taking away from it everything which the understanding thinks through its concepts, so that nothing may be left save empirical intuition. Secondly, we shall also separate off from it everything which belongs to sensation, so that nothing may remain save pure intuition, and the mere form of appearances, which is all that sensibility can supply a priori.
What does Kant mean by the mere form of appearances? In essence, he means the universal properties which shape every single appearance of things before our mind. These are the common features that belong to all appearances and make them appearances in the first place. In other words, he's considering the a priori transcendental conditions of appearance. Kant discovers that two conditions apply to every perception: space and time. Nothing can possibly appear to us, Kant argues, unless it appears in either space or time, or both. In a series of extremely complex arguments, he shows that we can't regard either space or time as a reality existing completely outside of us. We don't simply experience and observe space or time as if we were spectators. In order to appreciate Kant's reasoning, consider just one of his arguments.
Space is not an empirical concept which has been derived from outer experiences. For in order that certain sensations be referred to something outside me, and similarly, in order that I may be able to represent them as outside and alongside one another, and accordingly as not only different, but as in different places, the representation of space must be presupposed.
Kant's point is that we can't conceive of space as outside of ourselves without presupposing the very thing we're trying to conceive. The whole idea that something is outside of us already involves space, so it's quite impossible to say that our sense of spatial reality is something we pick up from experiences of the external world. There's no such thing as an external world unless we already view the world spatially. Kant makes this point in his own terms.
The original representation of space is an a priori intuition.
In other words, space is a concept that exists in our minds before experience, as the term a priori suggests. We bring space to our intuitions. They don't already contain it. Time receives a similar analysis.
Time is not an empirical concept that has been derived from any experience, for neither coexistence nor succession would ever come within our perception if the representation of time were not presupposed as underlying them a priori. Only on the presupposition of time can we represent to ourselves a number of things as existing at one and the same time, simultaneously, or at different times, successively.
Space and time are, Kant maintains, the pure forms of intuition. They're the basic patterns our faculty of sensibility uses to organize the mind's raw intuitions. Now, at the everyday level of experience, the empirical level, space and time are objectively real. All of our ordinary conscious experiences have been shaped in accordance with space and time. They are therefore experiences of a space-time world. But this doesn't mean that space and time are things in the world. They're part of the structure of our consciousness, not things that consciousness discovers originally outside of itself. Kant expresses this by saying that space and time are transcendently ideal. Strange as this account seems, it generally accords with modern physics. For example, Kant's account helps explain what's perhaps the least understood feature of space and time, namely that they are infinite. We're unable, for example, to imagine the borders of space. For what lies beyond the border? More space? We also can't imagine the last or first moment of time. For what would come before or after that? A moment beyond time? The reason for this, Kant suggests, is that space and time are not things that we perceive, but part of how we perceive and think of things. We can't help ourselves. We always perceive objects in space. This applies even to space itself, when we think of it as a single vast totality. In this case, we think of space as being inside another space, like a big empty box inside an even bigger empty room. In the same way, we can't think of a moment of time without imagining moments that come before and after it, even when we try to imagine the beginning or end of time itself. Kant's concept of space and time has interesting applications to a number of contemporary debates. For example, many cosmologists believe that the universe began with a Big Bang, an explosion that created an ever-expanding universe of space, matter, and energy. Kant's theory explains why our physical concepts can't get behind the Big Bang to the original state of the universe. According to Kant, there is nothing understandable before space and time. In his criticisms of Kant, Hegel notes that this theory of space and time has important limitations in spite of its merits.
But what the nature of space and time is, it does not occur to the Kantian philosophy to inquire. To it, what space and time are in themselves does not signify what is their concept, but only are they external things or something in the mind.
This is the end of Part 5. Please download Part 6 to continue.